to see whether that idea has traction and how they sell it and whether the thing is going to be delivered on the terms in which it's offered. But what can we do? Well, who is we? Okay, in print, and this is a long-standing theory of mine, and most politicians that I run this by, they do get an echo of this, they recognise this. From the day, probably from the day radio started, but certainly from the day the television arrived, it affected every new entrant in media, every new medium affects the voice of the incumbent. So the first thing that happened to television, the first thing that happened to newspapers when television arrived en masse was knock out the afternoon newspaper. The next thing it did is it forced black and white into colour. The next thing it did, we started to change the way we wrote. We wanted to write more colourfully. Talkback radio made us shout a bit louder. We put the cap lock on and we threw a few exclamation marks in there. And what the internet is doing now is just unleashing everything. So, and this is a strange reaction that newspaper journalists have to all competition from new media. They feel like they have to almost reinvent what it is they do. And what you're recognising, what the British public are recognising, is that at some point a newspaper started to sound like a barroom brawl. Now, the best thing the internet's doing to newspapers is forcing them to choose between down market or up market. There's no middle anymore. This is not a bad thing. Now, I expect a course correction in the next 5 or 10 years. There is going to be a premium again, and most of the journalists already recognise this. There's a certain journalist in Melbourne who runs at a different end of the market, but he has a very loyal readership now, and he's almost impossible to manage. And that's not a bad thing for the journalists, because sooner or later you're going to have a few of them who carry a particular audience with them, and if they're all shouting, what about the ones who come up with different content, especially when the mastheads think, especially the Fairfax and the News mastheads, the Australian that is, think the only way to hold market share now is to go highbrow, not lowbrow. I suspect that you'll see some course correction just because of that dynamic alone. Can't talk about Fleet Street because, and I say this is a third-party observation. Forget my vested interest because I've been with News Limited for 25 years in Australia. The interesting thing about Rupert Murdoch is that there's 3 marketplaces that he's influenced and affected. And I'll do the Australian one last. He went to Britain first, and he held a mirror up to British society and decided it was gossip, football, gossip, 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 run celebrities down, basically what worked is not something he created, but was something that was there and he caught it. He's gone to the US and he's created a particular kind of what do you call it? It's quite a ferocious form of media, but it does make sense in a US context. People do hold some of their values quite fiercely, and then you've got a form of partisan media in the US. A market was there. Now the Fox experiment you could never try here because our political culture is different here. What did he do in Australia when he first started out before he went to conquer the world? He tried to create a national newspaper to unify a federation. So in Australia, in a sense, what you're still looking at is a pretty young country that's looking for a national voice. In the UK, past empire, they're probably looking at beating up on people who are not like them. In the US, of course, it's been a form of civil war from the moment it started. So that's sort of my grand take on him. But again, if you ask me on the specifics, you ask me the specifics on whether we'll be able to improve our work, I think the market's going to push us to do it anyway because we're not going to be able to maintain quality media otherwise. Is this free-forming enough, Alan?
Thanks, George.
Is this free-forming enough?
We've talked a lot about citizen engagement. I'm very interested in the number of citizens in the big Australia debate and what your views are on that. We've had Tampa and Malaysia and Nauru and we're hunting them away, but Bernard Salt's saying we need 300,000 a year to keep the economy pumping. And if you're a 14-year-old in a coal seam gas part of Queensland, you're harassed by curb crawlers.
They're looking to offer you $100,000.
They want you to work for them.
Yeah.
There's just desperate skill shortages across that part of the resources sector. And I'm just wondering what your view is and where you think the country's going with that issue about immigration.
I got a pretty standard, I'd imagine, standard big Australia view on this, you can make the economic argument, but I actually think you can make the great country argument as well, because the thing that has been working in Australia is that at least half the population has come from somewhere else, or their parent has come from somewhere else. So we've got a young memory, which is not a bad thing, because we're not in the third or fourth or fifth generation. No disrespect to the third, fourth or fifth generation here, you're all successful, I grant that. But across the entire community, if you want to start settling on a particular idea of what your country is, you do get stuck very quickly. Australia doesn't have that problem whilst it runs pretty much one immigrant for one baby, which is essentially what our population policy has been since the end of the Second World War. Now, one of the other reasons why I think you need to do this is clearly the globe has been tipped on its head. We are, for the first time in our lives as a country, in the right place at the right time. And it's the first time in Australia's history that we don't want to be someone or somewhere else. If you think about the big national memory debates we've been having, firstly, not wanting to let go of the mother country at federation, and secondly, wanting General MacArthur to run the country during the Second World War, Australia was always trying to imagine something else, some other Anglo variation of what it could be. We're almost on our own now, which is not a bad thing, I think, for this country, because we're in the right place to be able to tap an Asian century. But you can't do that without people, unfortunately, because you get outnumbered very quickly. I don't mean that in a national defence sense, I mean that in a creativity and sort of social dynamism sense, because you don't know what the future is if you stop betting on people coming up with another idea. So I'm more on the creative rather than the property cycle version of why you'd want a big Australia. Now, of course, what's the big issue in the country today, and has been for a few years? It's basically service delivery at a macro level. It's an infrastructure. Now, the electorate has strange ways of manifesting this. Whilst the drought was on, and some of you might be aware of this, some of the state governments stopped asking the question of, states' rights versus national government, because the national government became a very popular option in opinion polls around 2005, 2006 for service delivery. Now, it doesn't actually make sense in Australia to run it all out of Canberra, but solving a water crisis was viewed as a Canberra responsibility, even though it's a state's issue. Forget where the climate change debate has gone now, but the other thing, this is big urban planning story that's going around now. One of the reasons why people have been backing away the big Australia is because they can't get from A to B. And it wasn't the return of the boats that soured sentiment to the regular immigration program. It actually predates the Oceanic Vikings. So in John Howard's final term, support for more migrants versus support for reduction in intake, you actually had a switch, and you can get this out of the Australian election study if you know where to look for it. So this thing predates the refugee issue, which means it's actually part of the supercycle issue. And the supercycle issue is actually a service delivery issue in its most basic sense. It's been able to get people from A to B. So one reason why I'd still run a big immigration program is sooner or later you're going to force governments to solve some of the planning issues. If the people don't turn up, you end up what happened here, which is slower population growth, net migration to Queensland, and then latterly to Victoria and even Tasmania and to Western Australia. Without the demand, you actually get run down in services, which is what's happened in New South Wales. I mean, the rest of the country is waiting for New South Wales to get up off the floor. And if you could ever crack some of your planning issues, you might actually have a pretty good business model for, whatever the next renovation of the country is.
Hi, George. I'm from New Zealand, and we've... sorry, I'll stand up.
Sorry, I found you. Yep.
That's fine.
Sorry, I heard the voice coming from the speaker, so I was looking in the wrong place.
We've actually had a couple of really successful women prime ministers from both sides
Yes.
of politics. I just wondered, I guess I'm maybe breaking from the title there a little bit, but I was interested in your thoughts about how the media is coping with the first Australian women Prime Minister, and how the media might be dealing with her, and how much that might actually be influencing people's perceptions around policy, etc.
Sorry. I can't disassociate the information age we're in with the noise that's around Julia Gillard. part of it is to do with gender, and things are said to her face, and everyone cites the example when Alan Jones called her a liar to her face and ticked her off for turning up late to an interview on his radio station earlier this year, as quite a disrespectful moment, which it was. But I suspect that disrespect was there before she became Prime Minister. I think it was building up towards the end of the Howard era, and Kevin Rudd certainly got a version of it. Now, how are the media handling her? Well, the media went from, and this is, I'm generalising here, and I try not to generalise because sometimes I have to remind people that there are, different layers to media. But in this instance, the sense I got was there was almost a coronation at play for the first month or so. The vibe was, isn't this terrific? And then you had, well, two things happened. One, somebody close to Kevin Rudd decided to leak against her in the middle of an election campaign, and you could see what happened. She just froze because did not know whether the thing was a form of stalking from whoever was leaking against her. So that was a difficult situation to be put in. The other, and you can't separate the circumstance in which she got the job. The difficulty with the manner in which she got the job is she hasn't been able to articulate to the electorate why it was she removed a recently successful Prime Minister. Just said that a good government had lost its way. Well, that in its own way creates an expectation that all the world's problems got solved tomorrow, which she could never do. I don't think she was ready for the job, and I think that's another reason why, but I think Tony Abbott wasn't ready for the opposition leadership either, because the policies that both sides took to the last election weren't about getting through the next term of government, whichever one of them won. They were actually about putting a lid on particular issues. So you had a paid parental leave 10 times more generous than the government's because Tony Abbott had an issue with women. So you had Julia Gillard trying to pretend to Western Sydney that she was more redneck than they were, so she went for Small Australia, which was that her or not, I'm not sure. So you had each side adopting the other's position. Tony Abbott's never going to touch the labour market again. Julia Gillard is going to be tougher than John Howard on asylum seekers. So gender does play a part in it, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this particular generation of leaders have been poor for a number of reasons, and I guess the language around Julia Gillard, some of it's surprising, and I guess she got treated in a way at the last election campaign that no male leader would have been treated. I don't think Mark Latham would have walked up to a Bob Hawke or a Paul Keating or a John Howard and done what he did. And I'm pretty confident that some of the more senior members of the press gallery, 10 and 20 years older than my good self, would have felt that they could say the things against Julia Gillard that they did say about guys their age when they were covering them. Now, but by the same token, a lot of those same senior press gallery journalists are picking up what you're picking up, and they think that there's something out of whack here. So I wouldn't hold it against them, but then I will then default to this other thing. If you're talking about specifically print, I don't think the noise is in print. I think the noise is web generated, partly for partisan reasons, partly because there are some crazy people out there, and picked up by a particular voice, talkback radio. And then, let's not forget, Kevin Rudd was the one who made it permissible to talk down to a Prime Minister because he turned up to everything. And the minute that you leave your last Sunday before an election campaign, you don't do Barry Cassidy on the morning for the insiders, you go and do Rove McManus that night, and you get asked, who would you turn gay for? At that point, I think a Prime Minister has empowered a particular strand of the media which hadn't been empowered before to talk down to politicians. So that's a long and complicated answer, but I do take your point, and I think if you've interpreted closely enough, I agree with a bit of it.
Thanks, George. Hi, my name's Jacinta. I think indicative of the silence in the room, this is very enjoyable, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thought-provoking also. I'm interested in your contention that all of the solutions are in the room, particularly given the immersion we've had today in citizen engagement, and the fact that I think there are about another 20 million people that might contribute to some of the solutions.
They might contribute, but you've got to interpret it for them. You have to take their feedback and then turn it into something that works for them. So they can tell you what's wrong, and they may offer the odd solution about fixing things, but I'm pretty confident that we're never going to get to one of these Japanese innovation from the shop floor models. I don't think that sort of thing applies in service delivery. I think it's a nice dream. It'd be terrific to be able to get 20 million Australians solving each of their problems on their own behalf.